think it works now. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this Brexit night. An analysis of a political accident. Yes, I think we can say that it is a political accident because it was about to happen tonight, around midnight. Brexit should finally take place, and now things have changed tremendously over the past few weeks. So just to shortly introduce myself, I'm Fenneke Wekker. I'm head of academic affairs of NIAS, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Sciences. And we host fellows, scholars from all over the world for a semester or a year to conduct their own research. And tonight we have 3 NIAS-fellows who will be in the panel and respond to Diederick Raven, who is Diederick is a cultural anthropologist at the University of Utrecht, and he has been writing on his manuscript called An Analysis of a Political Accident. So it is actually his title. He also teaches a course at Cambridge University in anthropology of globalization, which is concerned with globalization and issues of solidarity. And we have 3 wonderful NIAS-fellows here. Bas Jacobs, he's a professor in economics and public finances at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. We have Chris Colvin sitting over there. He is, let me see and say it correctly, he's a researcher at the Centre for Economic History at Queen's University in Belfast. And we have Aidan McGarry, and he has his PhD from Queen's University in Belfast, and he's now reader in international politics at the Loughborough University in London. And so the night tonight will be as follows. Diederick will tell us about his analysis, and we will have 3 guiding questions during this night. And that is, why did this referendum for a Brexit was called for? What happened in the whole process of establishing the Brexit? And how can we culturally understand why the British would go for a Brexit and why it is so hard to make it work. And then all our fellows will respond from their own perspective from finances, economic history, and the more protest, the voice of the protest. First, I will ask Aidan to give you a last brief update of the situation concerned with Brexit, because I'm not sure if you can still follow what's happening. Aidan can. So Aidan, please, help us out here.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so a lot has been happening in the last couple of days and weeks regarding Brexit, and there's been a lot of change. So I'm going to start by just kind of outlining the main highlights. It is kind of like a full-time job trying to keep up with developments in Brexit land, and I have a PhD in politics, and I'm still really confused about what has actually been happening. But please pay attention. There will be a quiz at the end, and if you don't get all the answers right, you will have to join the British government. I'm sorry. It may be harsh, but that's just the way it is. Okay, so in January and then again in March, there was May's famous deal was rejected twice, and then on Wednesday, Theresa May said that she would resign if her deal would pass, and somebody else would then take over the next phase of Brexit negotiations. The key challenges that she faces are from, on the one hand, the Democratic Unionist Party, which is the largest political party in Northern Ireland. They're very socially conservative. They are more unionist and more British than even the Conservative Party. And also they're kind of party within a party, which is the European Research Group, which is led by Jacob Rees-Mogg. So she needs both of these kind of partisan groups on side in order to pass the deal. Now, the European Research Group, including Boris Johnson, said that he or they would support Theresa May's deal, and Boris Johnson actually once said that this deal was like a suicide vest. So he changed his mind because he basically wants to become Prime Minister. And this confirms what a lot of us suspected all along, and that all of this is, Brexit and all of its ramifications is just a kind of play out of party politics within the Conservative Party and furthering the career of a few politicians. Now, due to the failure of the government to get a deal, Parliament has recently become a lot more active, and in particular the Speaker of the House, John Bercow. So his role is basically, if Parliament was functioning like an orchestra, then he would be like a conductor. And so he intervened and cited a law from 1604 that Parliament would not vote on something a third time, which is basically already voted on twice already. And I think through this whole Brexit process, we're becoming a lot more understanding these kind of bizarre and arcane laws within the British Parliament. He also, more significantly, called for a series of indicative votes. These are non-binding, and these were held on Wednesday. All 8 were defeated, but the most popular was for, on the one hand, a public vote, another referendum, and also for some sort of customs union. But all forms of Brexit were rejected by Parliament, including no Brexit. So basically nothing is acceptable according to Parliament, and it looks like there might be more indicative voting next week. Today, there was not quite the third meaningful vote for Theresa May's deal. She had to pull out the political declaration from this, which would declare the relationship that the UK would have with the UK would have with the European Union after Brexit. And so people were just kind of voting on the kind of withdrawal document. And that was rejected today by 58 votes. Now, because it didn't pass, it means that Theresa May doesn't have to resign. But this is the third time her deal has been rejected. So really, at this point, if she has any dignity, she probably should leave. So the next date, and the dates keep on changing, so the next date is April the 12th, and this is a significant date because this is the last day that the UK has to decide. And the reason that this is the last day is that Parliament is supposed to be going on holiday, supposed to be going on their Easter break, and because they've been working so hard recently and they really need a holiday. So, but also because in the midst of all this, we have the European Parliament elections, which are happening at the end of May. The European Union has been very, very clear and says, if you want an extension, if you want to remain as part of the European Union, even if it's briefly, then you must have MEPs. And so they basically need to decide by the 12th of April whether this is going to happen or whether it's going to be a no deal. And I'll just conclude before I move on that 7% of the British public think that the government is doing a good a good job of handling Brexit. And 7% might seem quite low, but I actually think it's surprisingly high.
Very powerful start. Thank you, Aidan. So just to remind you, the last 30 minutes of our event will be for Q&A. So you will have plenty of time to raise your questions. So now, Diederick, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I've got more slides than I have time for, which is normally, well, it's basically standard with anyone who's preparing something. Maybe you should read those 2 quotes. So the one is from a member of her cabinet. The Prime Minister is a disgrace. One day there will be an inquiry and she will be judged to have been unfit for office. This is one of your colleagues. The other is Dominic Grieve. This is the embodiment of reasonableness in the English Parliament. I've never felt more ashamed to be a member of the Conservative Party or to be asked to lend her support. They are friends from the day at the uni. She spent most of her time castigating the House for its misconduct. This was after she pitted Parliament against the people. In case you want to know what Brexit is, I've brought with me 3 definitions. The first one is the best one. The undefined being negotiated by the unprepared in order to get the unspecified for the uninformed. This is a letter to the Irish Times. This is the whole letter to the Irish Times by somebody. I found it really interesting. The other one is Brexit is a solution looking for a problem. The kernel of that remark is basically that, well, Brexit is about leaving the European Union, so apparently the European Union is some kind of a problem, but nobody knows exactly what kind of problem it has. What is for UK. And the other one is Brexit is 17.4 million who voted for the impossible promised by the untruthful. The amount of lying on an industrial scale, it's really amazing. And it makes you wonder, well, you know, it really makes you... I will not say not very much about the lying. It will take too much time for me. So here are the three quotes. If you look at the distribution of votes, one thing that should actually be quite clear is that basically the name Brexit is the wrong label, and it should have been called exit. If you look at the concept of British, that's a colonial concept and first used, how ironic, in the context of the plantations in Ireland. So this was when the Scottish and the English colonized in a really intensive way the island of Ireland. Island of Ireland. So basically it's the wrong label, but I'll stick to the traditional, now common way of looking at it. Okay, then we have this one. So, no, one back. So David Cameron called the referendum basically because he said, you know, the Parliament has been banging on about Europe for ages and people are sick of it. He also said, and I quote now, the lack of a referendum was poisoning British politics, so I put that right. Well, basically the one thing that a referendum did was poison it even more. But anyway, so we have the situation that he goes, Larry the cat stays, and has a quick Twitter account, so actually if you want to follow Larry the cat, and Theresa May comes in. The funny thing about, or basically the strange thing about it, she becomes Prime Minister without actually having a strong base in the party. The way I write it up in the book is in terms of history has chosen her. And the moment there was an election for party leadership, basically all the others stepped themselves in the back. Andrea Leadsom said, I'm a better mother because I have children. Theresa May is unwanted, childless, so that was a rather rude remark. And everybody was wondering why she made the remark in the first place, but that also meant she was out. So Theresa was in the end the only one standing, and hence it became a coronation. You could ask the question about what would happen if there would have been a runoff between her and somebody else. But alas, history is full of counterfactuals, but not much happened there. We can't do much with it. So when she became Prime Minister, she had a job to do. In my feminist attitude, so here you have a nice woman, and she comes up with a list, and basically you have to do everything. So we have the three big Brexit poisonous challenge. One is define what Brexit is, and basically that hasn't been happening at all. We're still unclear what it is for, and why you should actually do it, apart from the fact that 17.4 million people voted for it. The other thing is you have to find a path through the political jungle, which is not that easy, as we found. And the other thing is, of course, get a majority in Parliament. And if you look at the whole process in terms of structure, the chaos ranged from day one, starting with who owns the referendum result. And here the problem is that David Cameron, in a number of speeches, said, if you decide, the government will implement it. The only problem is that only Parliament can change laws. So laws had to be changed, so Parliament had to be involved. And basically what happened there is that Theresa took over that position, neglected Parliament without actually having a plan. And in case you're wondering, with the quote there from Lennon and McCartney, we all love to see the plan, that's from The Number Revolution. from the White Album. There was no plan, there was only an idea from, okay, the people voted for it and I'm going to deliver it. Don't know what, don't know why, don't know how. And here the interesting thing is she was a reluctant Remainer. And she made one of the few speeches that actually made sense if you look at them in terms of why would you remain in the EU. And that speech probably written by herself, as far as I can understand, or I've been able to find out. And that makes a very nice argument for staying in the EU. She was 4 times asked, now you know what happened and how difficult Brexit is, would you still vote? Would you still go for Brexit? And she refused to answer it. To me, suggesting that deep down she knows, in her hearts of hearts, it's a ludicrous position. But she never answered this, she never got involved in that question. But that's the way it is. So we have a situation that from day one, we don't know what we're doing. And it's not even clear how you're going to do it. So what happens next is, let's see, I'll go for this one. Basically what should have happened, and it's a rather interesting observation, or not interesting observation if you're living in the continent, what the English call the continent, is make a consensus. Try to get your people online, on board, or as the English phrase is, get your ducks in a row. And we all know that if you try to get your ducks in a row, they all sometimes wander off. But Theresa May was found from the beginning with a very small majority, 12. So David Cameron left her a majority of 12. She squandered that, had then a minority government of -8. Fixed that with getting the DUP on board, but even if she hadn't squandered her majority, she would have been in trouble. Because the European Research Group is too strong a voice, too radical a voice to actually accommodate it. So in my analysis, she should have started cross-party from day one, which in a two-party system is sort of an impossible position. You have to then ask the question, why didn't she go for that? And probably the answer is she is married, of course, to her husband, and she's secondly married, like a Catholic bishop, to her party. And she knows her party inside out and outside in, and she knows that the party is rather radical on the grassroots level. And she was not prepared. And I have sympathy for any leader of a big party, political party, for not splitting the party. So on that sense, I'm on her side. I can understand why she tried to appease it. On the other hand, we know it didn't work, and to a certain extent that was predictable. So she should have gone for another way, for another solution, but she didn't. That brings me to the obvious thing that basically is what's happened, is driving this whole debate. Is that on the one side you have the referendum challenge. I've defined that in the 3 Ds. I call that the Brexit enigma. And the Brexit enigma goes into 2 versions, or you have 2 sub-questions of it. The first is what I call the Brexit removal enigma. So she sent that Article 50 letter, and in my manuscript at the moment I have a PS to that letter. Where we're going, you'll be told in due course. Because we're leaving Brussels, but where we're going to live, well, in due course we will know. And the other thing is that it's the Brexit consensus enigma, what I've called the political equivalent to the transubstantiation, i.e. turning a majority against something into a majority for something. And that's difficult, because the natural position, put a number of people together, is they tend to disagree. So how do you get that done? And I formulated it in terms of, if you're a leader of a party and it's well organized, you can be sort of managing sheep. But the moment that you come up with something in favor of something, you have to turn a negative something into a positive something. It becomes herding like cats. And you all know that cats can't be herd. So that doesn't work. And she never engaged in any deep sense in how she would get that enigma of the consensus solved. If you look at her deal in terms of these 2 questions, You basically have to ask, does she solve any one of those questions? And I think the brute answer is no. So what's called May's deal, I object to that term, but that's for for later. I object to that term, but she doesn't solve any of these two questions. So basically what's happening is that the whole political process afterwards in getting her negotiation with the EU is never going to fit into these two questions. That's one of the reasons why it goes so badly. This brings me to what's called the Barnier trap to hell. So you have here the possibilities that the EU offered to the UK. And the debate that May should have had in terms of removal enigma or the consensus enigma is basically, where are we going? So the first option is stay. Well, that's out. The second option is what's now been called the Norway option. Then you have Switzerland, Belarus, and Turkey, what's basically not available for the UK, but officially there. And then you have the Canada option. There's much talk about probably on Monday that we're going to go for some kind of Norway option or customs union. I don't understand why the fifth economy in the world would outsource its customs arrangement to another party. It's absolutely beyond me. So in terms of logical thinking, which is sort of short of in England at the moment, at least on the political side, I don't understand that option. I do understand it in terms it's the less economically damaging one. So the logical option is basically the Canada option. It doesn't solve the Irish border question, by the way, so there's a problem as well. And the other logical option is basically the TWO option. That's a chaotic, no-deal economic suicide option. In terms of that, all the estimations of that plan tells you you're going to be in deep trouble. If you then go to another way of looking at the whole process, you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to explain if you're dealing with Brexit? This is sort of traditional academic exercise. The British explanandum in terms of why they voted for Brexit in the first place is not my interest. There is a good book on it, lots of statistics and lots of lying as far as I'm concerned, because if you make your sample small enough, you can probably come up with any kind of correlation you want. So the Brexit process in terms of why chaos, and you have the Brexit habitus question. And that is why is this attitude to Europe, and also for me included, is that why is this sort of attitude that May has towards her parliament is there? It has to be included in that one. If you then split that up, you get the chaos question in the following way. So I'll ignore all the unicorns. It was only the other day that I realized that in the weapon of the Queen there should be, here you see the unicorns. Does it? No, on the right you see a unicorn. It's actually in the weapon of Prince of Wales. But I'll ignore all the lying, I'll ignore all the other things. But it's an important element in understanding why the whole process goes wrong, in terms of you can't make policy based on lies. You can make a campaign, a political campaign based on lies. Just look at what Thierry Baudet did. But it doesn't make any good policy. And that's one of the reasons why the process becomes so extremely difficult, because you have to turn those lies into policies, and that doesn't work very well. So if you then try to split up, and I've mentioned only 4, is no deal, is that actually an option? Or should you actually, or should you actually skip it? There are incompatible starting points. There is this corpus mysticum in the terms of May knows what the people want. And my argument would basically be that's a kind of anti-democratic attitude. And there was no plan. So I'll skip a quite substantial bit now. I'll skip so much that I'll go to the end immediately. And I'll leave this. This is one of the nice cartoons in terms of what if you go for a no-deal Brexit. There is of course this element. If you go for a no-deal Brexit, the party that's going to be hurt the most. It's a logical, political, sensible. That's another thing, but it's a logical option. But if you're going to be the one who's hurt the most, you really have to think hard whether that's really an option. If you try to understand in terms of anthropological, I'll skip quite a lot. I'll show you this one. I'll make quite a bit of this cartoon. In terms of, and charge means in Dutch aanvallen. It also means, of course, you can charge this your battery, but in terms what you actually see here is two incompatible systems, and a large part of my argument is the UK has a completely different understanding of what sovereignty is. That has to do with the fact that the UK Parliament has absolute priority over the government. So political sovereignty in the UK is much more absolute than it is on the continent, where we all have written constitutions, and where in the end, in terms of what the UK sees as theological legalism, where you have explanation in terms of how the law is, whereas if you don't have a written constitution, basically everything is free. And the two don't match in the same way that these two don't match. And we all know, if you've been to England, that you need an adapter, and all the time you're struggling if you forget. Well, I was in England in September, and then of course you forget. So for the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time, I bought a new adapter. If you try to understand the chaos that's in the whole system, I'll skip quite a lot. Where are we? My argument would be that understanding from an anthropological point of view is trying to understand why the word humiliation is used all the time. The other word that's being used quite a lot is shackles. We're in chain. Now, I, as an anthropologist, I have the relative elegant position of I don't have to judge what people do, and I don't have to judge whether it's true or not. My only job is trying to explain why people think in certain terms, why they use particular language. And this humiliation is in the end what you need to explain. And, okay, part of the explanation goes in terms of British exceptionalism. We rule the world, which proves we are a superior race. That doesn't prove it, but okay, that's... And what's empire other than dominance of the races? So what you have ingrained in the national psyche of the UK is an imperial mindset. And in an imperial mindset, you either are the master or you are the slave. This is the Hegelian formulation of the whole thing. And the two, of course, go together. The UK won the war, but lost the empire. And in a deep sense, and if you listen to all the Pop's folk interviews, the war keeps repeating and repeating itself. What John Cleese sometimes said, don't mention the war. For people who voted Brexit, that's an impossibility. So after a while, I started thinking, okay, this is really an impossibility of what's going on here. And in my terms of my analysis, it's the following. If you're no longer a master, which obviously is the case with the UK, then you must be a slave, because the model is binary. Now, you're no longer the master, so you must be a slave, then there must somebody else be the master. And you can see that structurally the EU fits that, and the EU then becomes German occupation by a different name. In terms of process, what does explain the Brexit pandemonium? It started with no plan, and it didn't know what to achieve. Well, don't do this if you have 2 years of time, because basically you start the process 2 years and you don't have a plan and you don't know what to do. The myth of the people, the myth of the will of the people, that in the end had to degenerate into an anti-democratic stance. And May ran into that problem quite substantially. I've got in the book all kinds of quotes where I can show that. But that was impossible not to get into. She had an incoherent starting position. The Irish backstop problem is an result of that. There's no cross-party collaboration. I still find that impossible to believe, that you start with a national crisis and you start on a party political basis. It doesn't work. We've seen that. We have a weakness in terms of both May and Jerry Corbyn. It is no denying that's a big part of the problem, but it's there. You have incompatible results in terms of direct and indirect democracy, and you have a total misjudgment from the side of the UK what actually the EU could deliver. Final remarks. In terms of habitus, why the lack of understanding between the EU and the UK? Total different conception of sovereignty. I've already explained that. Two types of countries are there in the UA and in the EU. You have small countries and you have countries who don't understand they are small. Think about that one. And of course there's only one country that doesn't understand it's small. In terms of geopolitical environment, I think Brexit is a sort of ludicrous endeavour. You can't bully the EU into submission. One of the things that strikes me as very much is this bully tactic by May. She used it by postponing the vote, she used it in all kinds of ways, but it sells. That's why the notion of humiliation all the time comes back, because it's part of that. The EU is not an occupation force, and you can't free yourself from something which is not there. That's something. Okay, and the final remark. The EU may have its flaws, but Lady Thatcher did more to damage UK industry than the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diederick. Thank you so much. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, let's go to the responses. Bas, will you start?
Yeah, that's good. Let's see where I make this work. Yeah. Like, I guess most of the people here, I'm fascinated about what's happening on the other side of the channel for quite some time now. And it's sometimes very difficult for me to really understand the British mindset. And I hope to learn something more, and at least the introduction helped. During your talk, I had to think about Theresa May like the Black Knight in Monty Python. You know, the in the forest, and the arm is cut off, another arm. Come on, you coward! And somehow this image sticks to me. In any case, I'm an economist, and I have three remarks to make, basically two from an economic point of view, one from a political point of view. The economists were right. This was not Project Fear. The British economy already lost about 2% of GDP in growth ever since the start of the referendum. Since the referendum, the pound depreciated about 10% vis-à-vis the euro and the dollar, and many economists would then expect that exports would rise, but that didn't happen. Presumably people are not buying British cars anymore because they're not sure anymore whether the parts will be delivered when they have a repair. I don't know what's behind this, but the lower pound didn't boost exports, but at the same time we saw that real wages haven't risen since the referendum. Inflation spiked due to the drop in the pound. Imported goods have become much more expensive, and the foreign direct investment into Britain has fallen about 10 to 20% compared to the situation without all the Brexit discussions, and also outward foreign direct investment from British companies into the EU has risen with an estimated 12%. So we see that businesses are withdrawing from Britain and divesting towards the European Union. So the economists were right. This was not Project Fear, but maybe this is Project Pain, or even worse, Project Shame. So that's the first point I wanted to make. This is an act of automutilation, and this was seen as some strange story of economists that all the beautiful things that would happen after Brexit would materialize. Well, so far the economists have proven right. Actually, they were quite useful in informing the public debate in Britain. Then, the second point, and that is something that Nobel Prize winner Kenneth Arrow dubbed the impossibility theorem of political decision making. And this is something that I've seen. Basically, the Brexit discussion is a textbook case of that impossibility theorem. And I've explained it in very plain words so that everyone here can understand it. But the basic idea is that if you don't have a dictator and you have more than two policy options, say 3, soft Brexit, hard Brexit, and remain, and you have about 3 groups or more groups that have to decide on this, but they have different preferences. One prefers soft Brexit over hard Brexit over remain. The other prefers remain over soft Brexit over hard Brexit. And the third one, now you get the story. And actually, this is what's coming out of the British electorate. The point made by Diederick shows this, and also polls show this. So when people are asked whether you prefer remain, people say 44%, 65% says remain, and 44% prefers May's deal. But if you ask, do you want to have no deal or remain, people say, well, we prefer a no deal. And if you ask people, do you want to have the May deal or the no deal, then people say, we want to have the May deal. So people have intransitive, as economists would call intransitive preferences. It's impossible with the ideas of people in the electorate to aggregate this into political decision making. So for me, there's something very structural about what is happening in the British political system, that in any political system, including ours, it is possible to find situations like these where it's not feasible to aggregate the preferences of the people into political decisions. And this also might explain why David Cameron cannot be fully blamed for actually holding the referendum, because this was reflecting some part of the preferences in his party. It was a hard political constraint or incentive for him to do so, and probably he wouldn't have been elected as the political leader if he didn't hold the referendum. And there are long-term moving changes in the electorate that we don't only see in Britain, but also in our country, also in other countries, that basically drive people to more extreme political positions. And I think that the Conservative Party had to move into that direction, basically to kill the political pressure from the UK Independence Party and other people, just to remain a majority. And I think, but this is just an observation, that two-party systems are much more sensitive to this instability created by people flocking to the extremes than majority party systems. Look at what happened in the US. So this Brexit is for me a clear indication that whatever you might think about the failures of British politicians, there might be deeply rooted structural developments in the electorate of the UK that make it simply impossible for politicians to act in the national interest, because the national interest is not clearly defined. It is not possible to basically satisfy the political preferences of the people. And only if those preferences change, if people held different beliefs of what is best for the country, then you can get out of this gridlock. That would be my hypothesis. Final remark, and that's about politics. I think that, and here I'm going a bit off my own expertise, but I think that in order to explain what's happening in Britain, but also what's happening in our country, discussions about leaving the European Union or Nexit or whatever, what we've seen in some parties in our country, I think these are cross-cutting issues in most mainstream parties. So traditionally, mainstream parties were organizing themselves on social economic issues from left to right, and you very clearly had an idea where to position yourself. But those new parties position themselves on a social, cultural dimension and basically break the political equilibrium, move the entire political spectrum, and basically the middle evaporates. So the political parties now have to respond to all kinds of strong incentives on the extremes, and I think this makes it very difficult to deal with such questions as Brexit, but similar questions might arise in modern democracies elsewhere. And think of Trump and international trade policy, think of decision-making in the Eurozone crisis, think about how the Europe dealt with the migration crisis in Syria. I think all these things are deeply divisive in mainstream political parties, and they cannot really get a good position on these things. So here, but this is an observation from political science, I think there will be more Brexitants to happen in other countries in the future, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about Brexit's past, and in particular, their impact on the pattern of trade, both immediate and in the long run. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the historical record of the EU itself. What can we really ascribe to this particular institution? So I'm an economic historian, so I'm going to start by taking us back in time to the late medieval period. By the end of the 15th century, on the eve of the Renaissance, the combined value of English imports and exports constituted about 1/8 of British GDP, which was about £4 million in today's money. The English crown relied totally on the revenue of customs duties. There was no income tax, it was all customs duties. That's how it funded its wars. So it funded it entirely through taxing overseas trade. English merchants, especially in the wool trade, which was the key sector, were tied in a complex web of international trade finance with Europe. And access to continental markets was crucial for the continued survival of England. Trade was important even before the advent of modern capitalism. That's the point I want to make. And continental Europe was basically England's sole trading partner. But economic and financial ties were frequently severed during this period due to international wars, wars of religion, diplomatic disputes and conflicts. Basically, there were many Brexits, or Brexit-like events, and they resulted in temporary disengagement of Britain, disengagement from pre-existing European financial and trading networks. And these had to be reforged or they had to be replaced. It's an open question or not whether these mini Brexits were for the English economy going to be on comparable nature to the damage caused by this current modern Brexit. And it's an open question which is being dealt with by colleagues at the University of Reading who are starting a project on this at the moment. But certainly we can say that these Brexit-like events can be seen as a motivation for England to explore new markets in the new world, in the age of discovery, right? But the point I want to make here is these reorientation in trade patterns due to these Brexits were always temporary. Britain could never stay out of Europe for very long. This is simply a fact of British economic geography. In economics, and empirical researchers have time and again shown that Walter Izard's gravity model accurately describes the pattern of international trade. In its simplest form, the model echoes Newton's model of gravity. The force of attraction between two economies is directly related to their size and their distance apart. Larger economies and economies that are very close together, they trade more. The definition of distance we should broaden out to include other what economists call transaction costs. So we can think of these things as things like common language, common culture, common rule book, and they can reduce the transaction cost, they can reduce the distance. The model predicts international trade extremely well. Also historically, economic historians have shown this basically it works for all time. The model explains why, time and again, despite these Brexit-like events, Britain remains anchored to its closest neighbour, Europe. It finds ways back into the European family, just as no substitute was large enough or sufficiently sustainable for these previous Brexits. The evidence suggests, again, that no trade deal, whatever wishful thinking, no trade deal will substitute for the reduction in trade between Britain and the rest of Europe that will inevitably follow from this current Brexit. How much time do we have left?
What? 2 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about then, in these last remaining minutes, is briefly the gold standard. So another Brexit-like event was Britain's exit from the gold standard in 1931. It was forced out of this common currency area. You can think of it as a predecessor to the euro, where different countries linked their national currency to a particular weight in gold, and it fixed the exchange rate in. Now we know from more recent experience of the euro that this has downsides. If it's done incorrectly, people may invoke that particular Brexit as evidence that perhaps we should leave. Perhaps it's a good reason why now is a good time to leave Europe. Europe has got all these sorts of problems. Look at the euro, etc. I would say that would be a mistake. Although Britain didn't suffer as great a depression as, say, the Netherlands did during the Great Depression, which remained in the gold until 1936. The lesson to be learnt from that particular Brexit, which is something that I'm researching at the moment, is actually something quite different. Following that particular Brexit, Britain and other countries, they turned inwards. They put up trade barriers. Britain tried to reorientate its trade towards empire, away from its natural trading partners on the continent. It didn't work. The gravity model would explain why. It was temporary, and by the 60s they're begging to be let back in to the European Club of Nations, begging to join this new institution that had been established for the pre-runner to the European Union. They join. They take all the institutions as they are. A lot of them are really badly designed institutions, but they just have to take it. They even have there's an original Brexit referendum in 1975. They even have to. They win that. They join in with the European Club of Nations. These institutions that they designed, pre-designed, they just had to take them on board. Even though things like the agricultural policy were not in its favour. Which brings me to my very last point. I am convinced very much by the work of UC Berkeley economic historian Barry Eichengreen. He's written a counterfactual history of European integration, where he makes the argument that a lot of the things that we ascribe to the European Union probably would have happened anyway. Right? We shouldn't see the European Union as this amazing institution that has made all these things happen. The patterns of trade, the integration probably would have happened anyway. Anyway, the EU is not an unqualified success story. Besides the failures surrounding the single currency, there are many other things that we can point to that politicians exploit all the time as examples of very, very, very badly run, designed set of institutions. But like it or not, the accident of history means that economic integration took place through this particular route. This particularly badly designed set of institutions. That's what we've got. The EU is here. It is a thing. It functions in a reasonable way, at least for the British economy. Leaving is clearly a disaster, one Britain will regret, and I'll predict that Britain will come crawling back sooner or later, as it has done so many times before.
I'm going to stand because I have a slide, just one though. So I'm going to talk about, not yet, I'm going to talk about, I pick up a few threads that Diederick has talked about, trying to understand and also to kind of think about, is there a way out of this? And I'll talk about, I'll talk about democracy, and then I'll talk about protest, and then I'm going to talk about Northern Ireland. So the referendum was in June 2016, and the question was, should we remain or should we leave the European Union? And we all know the result, 52 to 48%. The referendum itself was not binding. It was not supposed to be a binding document. It was indicative. But since then, it has been used as the will of the people. And somehow not to fulfill this is a betrayal to British values and to the British people. Now, those who advocate for remain see this is the vote is illegitimate because of three reasons. One, the campaign to leave was a bunch of lies, including the famous bus slogan for the NHS. Secondly, illegal campaign financing on the part of those who were advocating to leave. And finally, the deal, and most importantly, the deal and the conditions of post-EU life was not actually clear. People need to vote on this. The vote was stay or leave. And if democracy is so important to those who advocate for Brexit, then why not have another vote? Well, it's obvious because it would not pass now. Estimates are that Remain has about a 10-point lead, and one respected political forecaster says that it would be about a 2-to-1, so maybe 66% would advocate to Remain. I don't know whether this is exactly true, and he basically makes the argument that that would be because a lot of people who didn't vote initially would then come out and vote for Remain. Democracy is a process, okay? It's not something that is static. It is something that that's why we vote every 4 years or sometimes 5 years in the case of the European Parliament for new politicians. The referendum was almost 3 years ago. So we can change our mind over 3 years. If Boris Johnson can change his mind overnight, then we can change our mind. And also, people did not vote for a hard Brexit, and they did not vote for Theresa May's deal. If it was that question, then it absolutely would not have passed. The second thing I want to talk about was protest. Now, initially there was a flurry of them, and there was protests in London, but also in different kind of regional areas and regional cities. And then it went quiet. And it went quiet because people just didn't really know how it was going to play out. It seemed very distant. Once Article 50 was invoked, there were some more protests, but it seemed very distant. People thought that it wouldn't maybe really. Saturday we had 1 million people marched in London. This was the largest in post-war Britain, alongside the protest against the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was also about 1 million. And the marchers were calling for a second referendum, so not to kind of call the whole thing off, but to call for a second vote. Additionally, on this theme of protest, we have the petition. Okay, so we have now, I think it passed into 6 million people who signed a petition, and this was submitted to Parliament. And this is to revoke Article 50. And Article 50 is the kind of the formal legal document which commits, puts certain kind of time restraints on making decisions. Most significantly here, it was actually Donald Tusk, who's the European Council President. He made a speech in the European Parliament earlier on this week, I think it was a Monday, and he said that those who marched in London and those who are signing this petition, they are heard by the European community, by the European Union. And finally, I want to talk about Northern Ireland. I think it's really amazing that Northern Ireland is such a major sticking point, which has a beautiful irony as well, because nobody talked about Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland border during the referendum. It was all about immigration. It was all about so-called sovereignty. I grew up in Northern Ireland. I was born there and I lived there for the first 28 years of my life. And I was brought up in a conflict zone in Belfast. So for the first 16 years of my life, it was violence, it was guns and bombs. And in 1998, The Good Friday Agreement was signed. It was supported by 71% of the people of Northern Ireland, and it brought peace to Northern Ireland. It also brought political arrangements and a number of other things. It doesn't actually say anything about it doesn't say anything about a border, but it does commit to peace and to take decisions which would not escalate conflict between the two communities, i.e. putting a border in place and having the infrastructure that you need on a border, i.e. British agents. And so a lot of people are then talking about the Northern Ireland border, and so to implement Brexit, which is a bad idea, you need to get rid of the Good Friday Agreement, which is a document that also the people of the Republic of Ireland supported as well. So 56% of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain, even though the largest political party, the Democratic Unionist Party, advocated to leave. So what we are left with is this kind of conundrum. It's a legal and it's a political kind of conundrum. So part of the island of Ireland would remain in the European Union, and part of it would remain, would stay, as part of the United Kingdom. And the question is really, well, how would this be managed? So one thing that those who advocate for Brexit say that technology will sort this out. So that means that goods and services and people and so on can pass through the border, and technology will kind of allow this to happen. But this technology does not exist. And they were asked, can you point to an example of anywhere in the world where this technology is used? And they cannot point to it. There's also a real fear of violence returning. If you have people manning a border, and if you have kind of border checkpoints, particularly where this is in the border of Northern Ireland, and this is where I can show you my slide. Okay, so here we have 3 maps of Brexit. So we have on the left-hand side, we have the transition period. So this would have, so the green line is the kind of the invisible border of Northern Ireland, but at the moment that would mean that there would be no checks. And then Belfast to Kinryan. Kinryan is in Scotland, and it's a very popular ferry terminal. So this is where kind of goods would come from mainland Britain. And then the backstop, the famous backstop, would entail still no checks on the island of Ireland. And it's not just one border crossing. There's like 130 kind of crossings between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. There would be some checks between Belfast and Kinryan, mostly related to agriculture. And then if there's a no deal, it would mean there would be heavy checks. It would mean there would be a border on the island of Ireland. And that's something that nobody wants. Theresa May doesn't want, the UK doesn't want, the European Union doesn't want, the people of Northern Ireland do not want, and the Republic of Ireland does not want. The only people that do are the DUP, and they want this because they are worried. They say that they do not want Northern Ireland to be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, even though it is on gay rights and issues of abortion and other things like that. But they're worried that if this backstop is implemented, and the backstop would be in place until the end of December 2020, and then would be renegotiated, and they're worried that it wouldn't be renegotiated, and that Britain, that the island of Ireland would remain basically in a single market, single market, and beyond a customs union. And their fear is that this would never be revoked. One thing that we also see throughout this kind of process is the arrogance and the ignorance of the British political elite vis-a-vis Northern Ireland, and also towards the Republic of Ireland as well. So one solution that they advocated for, like G.K. Bruce-Mogg advocated, was that Ireland should just join into Brexit as well, and you could hear the guffaws of laughter from across the Irish Sea as if this would happen. Sinn Féin, which is the second largest political party in Northern Ireland and the largest nationalist party in Northern Ireland, has been very, very quiet throughout all of this. And there's an argument that they are kind of keeping their kind of cards close to their chest, because if Brexit happens and if it is a complete mess, that it could actually lead to United Ireland, and it could kind of happen without them having to do anything. And I'll just end by saying that the European Union, I think, out of all of this comes out kind of quite well in some respects, because anybody thinking of their own kind of Brexit, like a Nexit or a Frexit, are probably at this point saying, no thanks. Yeah.
Thank you all for very powerful statements. Before we turn to you as an audience, Diederick, would you briefly like to respond? to the
Yep.
observations?
I'd like to thank Bas for pointing out, which was one of the questions I was struggling with, is if you look at Norway or if you look at Ireland in the way why they treated the Brexit question or the EU question in terms of national attitude and the national crisis where you need a national government. Bas points out that there is a deep fundamental element of problematic way of dealing with the kind of problem that's being raised by the referendum. I know the trilemma you pointed out, or the three-way, as already from Condorcet, who already pointed out that democracy has this problem. But it's helped focus my mind on understanding there is some really deep fundamental issue in terms of democracy going on here. And I want to thank you. If you give me your numbers, it would be very great. In terms of
They're on my Twitter account.
you're on my Twitter. I'll find it. In terms of remark, in terms of history, what struck me in being forced to read on the genesis of the European Union, I like to quote the French Minister of Foreign Affairs when the European Union Act was discussed in the French Parliament, and this is 1958 or 58. And he tells the French Parliament, okay, you may think there are 4 important blocks in the world. And you may think that, but actually there are only 2. That's America and Russia. And by the end of the century, you probably have China as well. Now, whether you like it or not, it's up to you in voting for what then became called as the European EEG, as the European Economic Community. That's up to you. But realize we're in a different mode, or we're coming into a different perspective. And if you don't vote for it, which basically, of course, what Brexit is, then you disentangle yourself from bigger historical processes going on. That I found really interesting, because basically already then, and the EU can't be understood unless you know that it's specifically trying to get itself back together again after the war. In terms of political clout, there needed to be some convergence in some way or another, and that's sort of what we the process of what we're now seeing. And you will reinforce that in a particular way. And I would like to read the reference. I'd like to have the reference to the book in the Counterfactual History of Europe. The other thing about the Ireland question, I have 2 remarks on Ireland. The first is the geography of Ireland is one, and it's divided it's divided by history. And the other remark is in terms of if you have a border, and this is what I always told my students when I was dealing with migration questions, is if you have a border and the border isn't a barrier, it's symbolic and hence expensive. And that's basically what we see. And if you look at history, we had a number of Brexits before. As you probably noticed, the note in Brexit is only that Britain is leaving something. It doesn't make it specific. Now, the British are particularly bad at borders. I'd like to point at Kuwait. We had a war over that. I'd like to mention Israel. We had how many wars over that? We have India. How many wars did we have over there, over the border? The English are extremely, bad at borders, and you have to ask the question, why is that? And that has to do, and the same goes for the Ireland border, for the border on the island of Ireland. That has to do with the empire. The ability of empire can be understood in the following way. It can erase the names of people. It can erase borders in the way it wants because it's the dominant power. So why is the Victoria Lake called Victoria Lake? It's not because the people living there did not have a name for the lake. but it's because the British at that time had the power to rename the lake. They had a power to redraw the borders in India, and we all know what happened there. And it's basically, at the moment, how many weeks was it ago when we had two nuclear powers fighting with another? Which never happened before, thanks to the British. The British are bad at borders because they had this imperial attitude, and sort of irony is that it plays out again on the island of Ireland. That's my final comment.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's have a round of applause. Okay, well, I have a few observations. Don't respond immediately, but just to kick off the discussion. So, Diederick, you say the British are bad at. The British have this imperial empire state of mind, but we do have other countries that have this history of being, or at least trying to be, an empire. So what would explain the difference between the Dutch, for example, and the British in that case, in that sense? And I wonder, could you or one of you explain why there are still people, if it's so obvious listening to your 4 stories, why there are still people really believing in leaving the EU? So that would be my questions. Please, open up. There are 2 people walking around with microphones. They will hold the microphone. Who wants to start? There's here a question. Is there? Will you start?
Yeah, Chris, I have a question for you. So this gravity theory, you said like eventually they will come back, and history proves that that model is so powerful. So why are we here? What's the problem? It's going to be all right, right?
Perhaps go to the second question first, and then you can cluster the responses.
Hello, Chris. I've also got a question for you, and I'm sorry I've forgotten your name, but it's also an economic question as well. With as you mentioned, the gravity as well. What I was interested, what kind of industries could overcome the cost of travelling? So I'm thinking maybe specialised industries like pharmaceutical companies or something like that, where it's a knowledge-based industry and it would overcome maybe the cost. And is that possible? And I've also got an interest. I'm also interested to hear what you would think about what kind of economic models Britain might go into after Brexit, because it would quite upset a lot of the established structure. So yeah.
Thank you. Who would like to start? Chris, perhaps?
Okay, so yes, we will return to the European fold eventually. I say we, I'm British, so I'm talking on behalf of the British nation. We will return to Europe at some point in the future, but it's going to be painful. Right? We won't be, what are we now, the 5th largest economy? We're not going to be the 5th largest economy. So there are significant costs. And yes, there are some industries that may be able to reduce the transaction costs. Maybe in IT, in services, some of these things, but they're never going to be removed totally. Our preferences, our cultural preferences, our tastes are much more aligned with European consumers than they are with say, African consumers. It's going to be much more difficult our cultural distance with these other parts of the world is just too enormous to overcome. Despite even if the physical distance could be overcome, there are many of these other barriers.
Bas, you want to respond?
Yeah, just 2 small comments. The first, that I really like that the gravity model is discussed here, because this is invented by Jan Tinbergen, famous Dutch economist.
That's debatable who exactly.
Oh, so maybe this is a Dutch bias, but the conclusion really is that we should keep calm and carry on trading. That's how I interpret your remarks. And And I think that when it comes to thinking about which industries, that's your question, I think it's what Brexit does, it's just raising trade costs. It's making it more difficult to trade. And yes, some industries might be more able to adapt to a condition or certain conditions with higher barriers to trade, but in the end it will be a loss for the UK. And estimates range from in the order of 3 to 4% structurally to more than 10% of GDP structurally. And if you compound that over time, you're making yourself poor. Then Tim's question, yeah, well, if we are so smart, why don't we do this? Why don't we listen to economists? And there's very good reasons for that. Not everything is economics. And I think there's a deep, so during the whole campaign on Brexit, there was, I think, a deep sense that the Brits wanted to take back control. And perhaps this is fed by feelings of insecurity, of having insufficient means to deal with things like globalization, migration, and all kinds of things that people perceive as risks or even threats. And I think this feeds the desire to have more control over the economy, over what happens in the country. I'm not saying that this campaign was right, but I understand where it comes from. Then the question is, of course, is it legitimate to shut your borders just to make sure that you control who comes in and out? Yes, that's a legitimate political choice. It wouldn't be my choice, but it's not only economics. There's other things that matter also.
Any other questions?
May I point out one thing about the pharmaceutical industry? The European Medicine Agency is coming to Amsterdam.
It's already here.
It's already here, I know. It's already here. 30% of the research that was done for that institute was done in the UK. Bye-bye to that kind of research. That's for one. The second thing, probably it takes 2 years longer for medicines to be approved in the UK, because pharmaceutical industries, they will come probably to Amsterdam in a more intensive way than they are at the moment in London, or in that triangle, Oxford, Cambridge, London. And the other thing is, the UK doesn't have an agency that can regulate its drugs. So on the 28 European institutions where the European Medicine Agency is an example of, you pay your fee to have these things organized on a higher level than the national level. And that makes, I didn't know that, but that makes an awful lot of sense. So you're paying quite a lot of money into the system where you get something back, and which is also quite substantially. And those costs will the UK economy has to take those costs as well.
Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, okay. Aidan.
Yeah, just to kind of think about why Brexit happens. We all understand that it's such a kind of terrible idea, and one of the reasons is, I think in the UK there is a virulent anti-EU media, and the largest newspapers like the Sun and the Mail and the Express and the Times, they all have a kind of anti-EU agenda. And for years, I mean, this has been, it's been kind of, every few days it's a headline, and there are certain lies and tropes about the EU. One famous one being the banana. So the banana has become the symbol because the EU wants really straight bananas, and the Brits want a curved banana. And this is a kind of a serious kind of issue. But I think people don't really kind of think about other arguments because they are just kind of, they're engaging with a conservative right-wing media which is anti-EU. And the other issue is around the global relationships of the UK historically. So it's not just Europe, it's also the Commonwealth, it's also the United States. And so Britain has kind of tried to have its cake and eat it in many respects, and it hasn't managed, to kind of, I think, negotiate those relationships as well as it could. And it's always seen the European kind of community as lesser or as undesirable. But as these kind of questions about trade come in and post EU trade, with the United States, then there's stories circulating in the very same British media about chlorinated chicken and maybe avocados not reaching British supermarkets, and now people are getting really worried.
Okay, thank you. Please.
So it seems pretty clear whether you're looking, from an economic, historical, or political perspective, this is all a colossally bad idea that hasn't yet actually happened yet. Are there any pathways to avoid it? You read in the press, or I've seen a couple things where, we talked a lot about things that are quintessentially British. There was one comedian, I think, who sort of said, well, we'll quickly revoke Article 50, and then it'll be like the time Uncle Roland got outrageously drunk at Christmas, and we all just pretend it never happened. And that's very British, and that's what we're going to do. And then at the same time, you also read pieces where they'll say, like, well, it can absolutely never, even though everyone knows it's bad, and the economics is bearing it out, and we know this is a mistake, we worry about protest. And then at the same time, the people who really voted to leave, as I understand it, are elderly and are not necessarily going to be taken to the streets, but there is the right-wing media. So kind of, is there a path, whether through another referendum, the Article 50 revocation with the petition, or is it just inevitably going to happen and you'll come crawling back at some point?
Okay, let's wait. Let's
if I may, there's this.
One second. So we'll cluster some questions.
If I can be a bit of a devil's advocate, a couple of things that I missed in the discussion is, we talked about Theresa May, but what about Jeremy Corbyn, who played a really, really questionable role during the referendum? He's a Brexiteer, and he might go down as the worst opposition leader that UK has ever had. Even Michael Foot would be. That's one thing that I think is important that hasn't been discussed. Another thing that's really important is the role of defence. We haven't talked about defence. UK is a major defence player and will continue to be so for some time to come. So I was wondering what the panel thinks about that. And then a question about the arrogance, I'll put that word, that Diederick Raven talked about. I think if you look at from the British point of view, they also, some Brits think, well, when's the next time that the European continent will have a major war and we, the Brits, will have to go to save the day? So I was just wondering, does that factor in that aspect too of, how does Britain's role with Europe in terms of security, and because that, the Norman conquest, if we're going back in history, is, one of the worst genocides ever, so.
Thank you for those questions. Who would like to respond?
May I have a go at it? I think the question before going into is there a way out for the English or for the Brits, the question should also be, would we want them to stay? And I have in the book, at least in the manuscript, I answer that question in terms of say, please go. And the argument for that is that in terms of geopolitical reasons, they should stay. And one of the reasons for that is security. But when the body politics of a country is that worn down, as it is at the moment in England, you don't want that member to be part of your club. Although you want you don't want to be the UK part of your club, because there is no way that you can actually participate in the whole process in a constructive way. The point, of course, is the sleeping membership doesn't exist for the EU. You're either in or you're out. Is there a way out? Well, that's obvious. You just revoke. Does that solve the problem in the UK? Not one bit. But here it comes, and I did say something about Jeremy Corbyn, but I think both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are extremely bad leaders. History has chosen two of the most inept leaders to be leading the main parties in England, and that brings me back to the point that the UK can get out of it, but it has to heal itself, and that will take an awful long time, because the whole system is. People are talking about Brexit-related stress disorder. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Chris.
So in 1688, there was this thing called the Glorious Revolution, which I like to call the Dutch invasion, right? So Willem III, also coincidentally William III, because the numbers tell it, basically was invited to invade England. He brought with him troops. Dutch troops occupied the streets of London for a number of years, subjugated the English. The Dutch king consolidated his rule over England by invading Ireland, and all the William of Orange consequences there. So, but it worked. It worked. No, it worked. It brought prosperity, Dutch institutions, good to replace all the awful English ones. We had a financial revolution, brought sovereign debt. The idea of borrowing money to finance war, essentially, was this Dutch invention that was brought to Britain. What we need is another Dutch invasion.
It's been long since I felt a sense of pride to be Dutch. Bas, you wanted to respond?
Yes, to the question, is there a way out? And for me, it's not a question of bad leadership. That's too easy, because these people have been elected, have come through this system that has particular structures and incentives. And apparently the structures and the incentives are such that these people get in these positions. So there's something more than just a character flaw or something like that. It's not only a morality tale. And I think that is related to the point I tried to make earlier. There's, I think, deeper structural developments in the electorate that make it very difficult for mainstream parties everywhere in the Western world to respond to that and to get governable majorities in their governments. And I think what we are seeing in the UK is a reflection of that. The Conservatives had to respond to these conservative parts in their party, and this was in part due to the emergence of the UK Independence Party. So I think it's not only character flaw, and also what we saw last week, we had 8 votes on 8 different options, the indicative votes, and they all basically proved that Era was right. That there is these inconsistent preferences in Parliament, and these inconsistent preferences are, I think, to a large extent, a reflection of the political preferences of the UK electorate. So this is something that cannot be easily solved unless we start agreeing more on certain issues, so there has to be less disagreement in their political views, or there has to be changes in the political decision-making structure. But other than that, I don't see how you can get out of this. So I'm not that optimistic.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Let's go into the back. The woman in the back. Okay.
Question for Aidan. What do you think the consequences of whatever happens, Brexit, Remain, will be for the regions? Because at the end of your presentation, you touched upon Sinn Féin and their silence. Do you think that they'll be punished for that by maybe another political party rising up in Northern Ireland or something like that? And also at the same time in Scotland, the SNP have been very vocal about Brexit and also independence, but at the same time I feel like people feel that the other worries in their daily lives have been neglected. So maybe there will be some sort of a disruption there as well.
Let's cluster this question with the gentleman in the front.
Right, I was in discussion with a baroness from the House of Commons, and I say baroness because it really limits the amount of people who I could have spoken to about 80% of the House of Commons. And the discussion was basically that there were certain things that she thought were the main things that really went wrong. And before the Brexit, she mentioned the economic trickle-down effect of Brussels on the income levels in Britain. And there was an article in the NRC, the Dutch newspaper as well, on this right after the referendum, saying that there is actually an economic argument for people who are in a lower income bracket to vote for exit, due to the fact that they had less benefits trickled down to them relative to the higher income brackets. Now, the question is, on that side, how big is that effect, you think, according to you? Secondly, after the referendum, the number one problem that May had was complacency. She started negotiations very, very late, incredibly late. So what is the effect of that very late stance that she took for the negotiations, according to you?
Thank you. Aidan, what do you?
Yeah, I think the question on the regions is a really good one. Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted to remain, England and Wales to leave. I think the case for independence will be stronger and more vocal from Scotland, and I think that Scotland will, if Brexit happens, I mean, Scotland is more like a social democratic, it's more of a kind of Scandinavian style, and also its politics are much more kind of social as well, on the left, I would say, and I think it's more likely that if anyone goes, Scotland will go first, and I think that, but that all depends on what type of Brexit kind of comes out of it. If it's a real disaster, then I would expect Scotland probably to really advocate for independence within 5, maybe 10 years' time, and they would have a very good case to do so. And if that happens, then I think that Northern Ireland would probably be next. But I mean, who knows? I'm also hearing people talking about kind of Welsh nationalism, which has always been kind of dormant and based around language. Has now started, people talking about kind of Welsh independence and so on, but they voted for Brexit, so they deserve it again.
Diederick.
If you Heineken, the beer magnate, made with a number of historians and political scientists a map of the regions of Europe, and it's worth looking at that map because he got quite a number of things right on that map. For example, the way that Czechoslovakia split up. He got exactly that map right. It's exactly on that map. In that map, Scotland becomes independent. You can see basically why the DUP is so much against the whole thing. Is for them it's the union first and everything else is second, third, or whatever it is. They are scared as hell for the Good Friday Agreement, and in the Good Friday Agreement is built in an argument that the UK government should take no stance whatsoever, A, on the political process in Northern Ireland, and B, if Ireland and Northern Ireland vote to join, that's okay. There already is standard policy in the UK, so you can see why that coming together on the island of Ireland is almost automatically built in. In terms of numbers, we're already there. But this recent emergence of Northern Ireland identity is sort of holding it back. That's one thing. The other thing is in terms of what the question was, the trickle-down effect. Bas, do you have anything on that?
Yes. So the EU budget is 1% of European GDP, and the English or the Brits contributed lower than EU average to the budget. I think it's negligible on the average income of the Brits. However, and this is paradoxical, in the counties where the support from the EU was biggest, there was more support for Brexit than in counties or in districts where there was less support for Brexit. Sorry, let me rephrase. In counties where they received more money from Europe, there was less support for Brexit than where they received less. So this is a paradox. Second, domestic policies are far more important for low-income people in the UK than anything that Europe does. And we have seen the Cameron government during the Great Recession doing massive austerity, cuts in spending, social spending, healthcare, the tax credit, the universal credit, grabbing together a number of income support programs that drove down many people into poverty. That were policy failures at the domestic level, and I've seen research that documents that if these things didn't happen, then Brexit might not have been voted for. So I think that domestic policies are important. I think they're far more important than European policies, and when they're done well, they might have given a totally different outcome for the Brexit referendum.
Thank you all so much. Let's continue our discussion more informally with drinks. Please stay to have an informal chat with our speakers. And thank you all so much.